Hey everyone, I'm Mike. I'm an aspiring professional artist and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about a few things that might possibly be able to help you learn art a little bit better. Alright, let's get started. So have you ever wondered why it seems like you're learning things really slowly or not at all? You draw a perfect head or face one day, then a week or two later you try again and it looks horrible? I know I have. I've dealt with that pretty frequently actually. So hopefully this video can help you kind of break through that barrier. Now before I get into all of that though, I do want to say this. These are just tools that you can put in your toolkit. It's not something that might be a solve for all of you. For some of you it might. That's because everybody's brain does work a little bit differently, right? So just because this method works for somebody else and not you doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you, right? It's just that your brain works differently, and that's okay. That should be celebrated. We're all different. So let's start off by talking about two neurological components of your brain's ability to learn. Those two components are called working memory and long-term memory. The working memory works in the short term, right? So it's our ability to remember things as we are doing them in the moment in order to help us get through it. Think of the game of memory, right? So you put the cards face down, all matching cards, and you try to figure out which ones are where, right? That's our working memory in that moment. Now, our long-term memory is, as you might have guessed, our ability to pull a book from our bookshelf within our brain from something that we learned several years ago and make use out of it now. So these two pieces actually work really well together. What happens is we have to use our working brain consistently over a long period of time, meaning like a few weeks probably. That probably is going to differ between person to person, but I'd say a few weeks is a pretty safe bet. And at that point, it starts to get retained in our long-term memory. So for instance, that example I gave earlier of being really frustrated that something you drew a few weeks ago looked great and it felt really good while you were drawing it, and then you go to draw it again after taking a few weeks break from doing that topic, and it's not easier and it actually might look worse, right? That's because you have to continue to work on that specific topic over time in order for it to be retained in your long-term memory, aka in order for you to learn it. So that's kind of the foundation of what we'll be talking about throughout the majority of this video. There's another piece of this that's really important though. Your brain only really stores things long term if you're emotionally regulated. This is because of how you access specific portions of your brain, or actually how you can't access them when you're emotionally dysregulated. The part of your brain that's in charge of storing information for long-term usage is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus works in an interesting way, because if you actually experience some lighter forms of discomfort or stress, you actually start to learn things a little bit better. And what I mean by that is you're learning something. The discomfort, the light discomfort, is that you're learning something new, but it's something that you find enjoyable. There are slight failures along the way, but you're able to kind of overcome those slight failures or minor setbacks. That's kind of the discomfort that I'm talking about here. But the problem with that is if that light stress kind of journeys into being actually stressful, then your brain is going to start to release chemicals that block your ability to store those things in your long-term memory. So it's a very fine line, but basically you don't want to be at your desk getting severely frustrated with what you're working on. You want to sit at your desk, have light frustration, work through it, and then once it starts to feel good and you're starting to get it, or if it's going in the complete opposite direction where you're getting really upset, you have to take a break. You have to make yourself stop for a little bit and then come back to it again a little later. So I'm going to take this and pull it into a totally different example. So I work with kids pretty frequently, or at least I used to, and the one thing that you learn about kids is how their brains function and operate, and this is actually true of all humans, once they get upset. So the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that is involved in the working memory that we were talking about, but it's also involved in critical thinking, right? If you look at a kid at a store, for example, and this kid asks their parents or parent for a toy, and the parent says no, and then they start to cry and they start wailing and they're sitting on the floor, and parents start to get frustrated with the kid because they're not able to even listen to simple directions of get up, come here, and get in the cart so we can go. And the reason for that is because they've gotten so upset and dysregulated in that moment that they've lost access to their prefrontal cortex. They've lost access to their ability to listen to those directions, understand them, and follow through with them because they don't have a working memory anymore. And at that point, because your working memory isn't actually doing things, you're also not able to store those things in your long-term memory. So this is a pretty interesting example, I find, because it's pretty easy to visualize a little kid. You probably might even be able to remember yourself as a little kid. You get really upset and you're like, I can't even remember what they were telling me. That's why, because we lose access to that part of our brain. So I kind of started to touch on this, but the next theory that I want to talk about is called spacing effect theory. Mark Burnett actually did a video on this, I think like a week or two ago, and I highly recommend it because it's very accurate and it's actually very helpful. So basically, spacing effect theory is the idea that learning things in little chunks at a time with breaks in between and then repetitively is a superior learning method when compared to just cramming. So let's look at two examples that are probably going to seem way on the opposite ends of the spectrum, but let's take the example of cramming for a test versus your ability to recall advertisements. So have you ever waited last minute to study for a big test, and within an hour or two you just went over everything that you needed to know right before the test? I'm sure a good portion of you have. I definitely am very guilty of doing this, especially in college. So you might have went ahead, taken the test, and done pretty good on the test, right? You probably passed. Some of you at least. I know I failed a few. But the real question is, do you remember all of that information that you got correct on that test today? Okay, that might be a tall task. What about, do you think that you would have remembered it a few weeks after you took the test? What about a few months? The answer to that question is probably no, right? However, I bet a good portion of you can remember advertisements that were really either funny or annoying on TV a few years ago. Why is that? Well, ads actually use spacing effect theory a lot, right? It's a short burst of material spread over multiple weeks, and if you're on the same channel for a few hours, you probably see those ads 5 to 10 times in one sitting. The information is able to be retained in our brains longer term because we aren't experiencing an overload of like 2 hours of material, right? Rather, we're seeing a tolerable 30 seconds of material over the course of several weeks and several times a day over those weeks. So I'm going to come back to how to actually apply these topics and theories in just a second, but I do want to talk again about my disclaimer in the beginning. So I do want to give again my light disclaimer from earlier. So I am a therapist. I've been working in the field for a few years now, and I would say I'm like relatively knowledgeable on some of these topics. I understand them at least somewhat well. But with that, I do want to say I also understand that these things might not work for all of you, right? It might work for some. And that's because everybody's brain is different. Everybody is able to retain information differently. Everybody needs a different method to help them retain information differently. But the hope is that this is just another tool in your toolkit that you can learn or use to learn things if you're having trouble. So I do hope it's helpful, but please don't be upset with yourself if it's not, or don't beat yourself up over it or think that there's something wrong with you. Everybody has different ways of learning, and that's okay. Be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, and just keep looking at videos like this that might be able to guide you in the right direction. So, the lesson that we have kind of gathered from working memory, long-term memory, and the spacing effect theory is that in order to not overload our working memory, we need to be at least relatively regulated while we're working. We want to stimulate our brain to learn something new in order for us to have an emotion to attach to the long-term memory that's being put in our hippocampus. And then we also want to chunk it out into 20 to 30 minute study sections with a break in between. Now, the break in between, it shouldn't be you cruising on your phone for 30 minutes or something like that, playing a video game. It needs to be something that you're going to not use like any part of your brain. Play with your dog, play with your cat, meditate. Try to find maybe like a funny podcast or something like that to listen to. Give your eyes a little bit of a break. Don't listen or don't try to learn something else. Don't, go into another art YouTube or something like that and look at those videos and try to cram other information in your head. Give your brain an actual rest. So I do want to kind of highlight something that I did over the course of a year that you can even see in some of my past videos, the progress that's been made, and that's with my gesture drawing. So this is why I think that this method is super effective. If you look at my gestures even in today's video and compare them to gestures from several months ago, there's been a ton of improvement. And the reason for that is because I do gestures for about 30 minutes 2 to 3 times a week, and I've been doing that for a year. So as I've been doing that, I'm taking those breaks in between by stopping for that day and going on to something else, and then I'm also doing the repetition, and it's helped me dramatically to the point where I can do imaginative work at least at a decent level at this point, which is not something I would have been able to say even a few months ago. So that's why I think it is really helpful to do this. Now, I will say most people aren't going to be able to retain stuff if you're cramming. That's not an effective method for long-term memory. But I just wanted to say that part because I do believe in that. I don't necessarily know if these methods that I've been giving you are going to be helpful for you as an individual because, like I said, everybody's brain is different. So there are a few more things that I wanted to talk about that might be a little bit difficult to discuss or hear. So the first thing is, with my example that I just gave, I also still draw every single day. Now, you don't have to draw every single day, but you do need to draw more often than you don't. So given a 7-day week, you might want to draw 5 days a week or 6 days a week and maybe take a day in between if you are feeling a little burnt out. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to try to learn something and then hang your pencil up for 5 months and then come back and expect to be where you were. And the reason why I know that's probably hard for some of you is because some of you might not be quite ready to make that leap, and that's okay. It's just that if this is something that you're really serious about, you want to improve and you want to become a professional, you do have to work hard. You have to think a lot of professionals that are already in the business are working 8-hour days, 5 days a week, and they are working really, really hard to perfect and hone in on their craft. So in order to catch up with them, you have to put in maybe not an equal amount of work, but you have to put in some work, right? The other thing is, once you start to learn something in quotation marks, you don't want to think, oh, I'm done. I don't have to go back to that ever again. That's not true. Over time, our brains actually start to lose some of the information, even if it's been stored in our long-term memory. But what happens is we kind of backfill it with things that we think are correct. So if you think something is correct and it isn't, then you start to learn something incorrectly. So I would always recommend, after at least maybe a few months, if you've quote unquote learned something, go back to it and relearn that specific thing, either using the same source that you got it from before, or maybe a different source to see if there's some more interesting things that you could possibly learn. And that way you are kind of refreshing that long-term memory and instilling information in a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and you're going to also be able to pull things apart from those experiences that will help you kind of retain that information more accurately. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. I had a lot of fun making it. Hopefully I can do videos at least somewhat similar to this, maybe figuring out ways to help people regulate right before they go into drawing or something like that. That would be a lot of fun to do. But anyways, I appreciate all of you for sticking around to the very end. I'm Manga Mike, and I'm out.